Welcome to Compact Murders from CompactHistories.com, where we take a look at real murder cases, assassinations, and serial killers in short, bite-sized episodes. Before we start, a quick announcement. A brand new podcast has joined the Compact Histories family. It's called Compact Science, and it brings you clear, straightforward explanations of science-related topics, all in the same short, bite-sized format. Look out for Compact Science wherever you get your podcasts and on CompactHistories.com. Available now. With that being said, let's get back to the show. This is episode 75, Harold Shipman. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on the 14th of January 1946 in Nottingham, England, and for many years he appeared to fit the image of a dependable, hard-working local doctor. He qualified in medicine at the University of Leeds in 1970 and began his medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire before moving into general practice. To neighbours, colleagues and patients, he projected calm authority, intelligence and reassurance, the sort of manner that often earns a GP deep trust over time. That trust would become one of the most disturbing features of the entire case. In the 1970s, Shipman worked in Greater Manchester and later became closely associated with Hyde, the town where he built the professional identity that would make him seem almost beyond suspicion. He was not a flashy public figure or a celebrity doctor. Quite the opposite, he was familiar, ordinary, and embedded in everyday life. Patients saw him in surgeries and during home visits, often at their most vulnerable, and many families accepted his word without hesitation because that is what people were used to doing with a trusted family doctor. Shipman was eventually found to have murdered large numbers of his own patients, most of them older women, often by administering lethal doses of diamorphine and then certifying their deaths as natural. An official inquiry later concluded that he had killed at least 215 patients over a period of 24 years, and that the true total was likely around 250, with the killings beginning in 1971. Those figures turned the case from a shocking criminal prosecution into one of the gravest betrayals of trust in British medical history. What makes the opening chapter of the Shipman story so chilling is not that he looked sinister or behaved like a man obviously heading for ruin. He looked safe. He looked established. He looked exactly like the kind of doctor people were taught to rely on, which is why the darkness of what followed was able to hide in plain sight for so long. Before Harold Shipman became known as one of Britain's most notorious killers, there were already serious signs that his career was not as spotless as it appeared. After qualifying in 1970, he worked in several medical posts, but his early professional life included misconduct that should have raised lasting concerns. In 1975, while working as a GP in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, Shipman became addicted to pethidine, a powerful opioid painkiller. To feed that addiction, he forged prescriptions and obtained the drug by deception. In 1976, he was convicted, fined, and briefly dealt with through the medical disciplinary system rather than being permanently removed from practice. It was clear, therefore, that years before the murders drew national attention, he had already shown a willingness to abuse his position as a doctor, falsify medical records, and manipulate systems designed to trust professional judgment. Those behaviours did not yet expose him as a murderer, but they did reveal a pattern of deception and control. He entered treatment for his addiction, returned to work, and later rebuilt his career in Greater Manchester, eventually becoming a GP in Hyde, where he developed the image of a respected local doctor. In Hyde, Shipman's reputation was, on the surface, strong. Patients often viewed him as serious, competent, and dependable. He made home visits, spoke with authority, and operated in the familiar world of British general practice, where doctors were commonly trusted without much question. That combination of medical status and local familiarity gave him enormous freedom. It also meant that odd patterns could be explained away. Elderly patients die, doctors sign certificates, families grieve, and life moves on. In that setting, suspicion did not come easily. For years, the deaths around Harold Shipman did not trigger the kind of scrutiny they should have. He was a GP, many of his patients were elderly, and he often attended them at home, exactly the kind of setting in which a doctor's judgment carried enormous weight. When a patient died, Shipman was frequently the person who certified the death and recorded the cause. In many cases, those causes appeared ordinary on paper, especially to grieving relatives who had little reason to question a trusted family doctor. That was one of the key reasons the pattern remained hidden for so long. But when investigators eventually looked closely, the pattern was hard to ignore. The Shipman inquiry later concluded that he had killed at least 215 patients between 1971 and 1998, and suggested that the true number was likely around 250. A striking feature of the case was the concentration of elderly female victims, many of whom were found dead at home shortly after Shipman had visited them. The inquiry also found that he commonly used diamorphine, a medical form of heroin, to kill patients and then falsified records to make their deaths appear natural or expected. There were also behavioural details that became more sinister in hindsight. Some relatives recalled that they had been surprised by how suddenly their family member had died, or by how firmly Shipman seemed to control events after the death. In some cases, he discouraged post-mortem examinations. In others, he had been the last known person to see the patient alive. None of these facts alone automatically proved murder, but together they formed a grim pattern of opportunity, concealment and repetition. What had looked like routine medical care began to look like a system he had learned to exploit. One important turning point came when another GP raised concerns with the local coroner regarding the large number of cremation certificates she was asked to countersign. That observation fed growing concern among other professionals in Hyde. The deaths still did not immediately lead to a murder charge, but by this stage, the numbers, the circumstances and the repetition were becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. The doctor next door was beginning to look far less ordinary. By 1998, the pattern around Harold Shipman was becoming harder for other professionals to ignore. Following concerns raised to the coroner earlier in the year, the police began an investigation, which was conducted through March and April. Although it failed to uncover enough evidence to act, the concerns did not disappear. Instead, they lingered in the background, waiting for a case that could not be brushed aside. That case arrived in the summer of 1998 with the death of Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old former mayor of Hyde. She was found dead at home on the 24th of June 1998, and at first her death appeared to fit the familiar pattern of a sudden passing certified by her doctor. But then her daughter, solicitor Angela Woodruff, was shown a will that supposedly left Kathleen Grundy's estate to Harold Shipman. It immediately raised alarm. The document did not look right, the contents made little sense, and Woodruff reported her suspicions to the police. What had previously been unease about death rates was now tied to a possible forgery, with Shipman himself standing to benefit. Once investigators focused on the Grundy case, the wider picture began to shift rapidly. Grundy's body was exhumed and diamorphine was found in her tissues, strongly undermining the appearance of a natural death. Police also examined Shipman's records and discovered that computer entries suggesting she had been addicted to diamorphine had been added after her death. The forged will itself proved clumsy rather than brilliant, and that may have been Shipman's fatal mistake. After years of operating under the protection of trust, routine paperwork and medical authority, he had stepped into an area that drew immediate legal scrutiny. Shipman was arrested on the 7th of September, 1998. By that point, suspicion was no longer a whisper among local professionals. It had become a full criminal investigation. Once police started re-examining other sudden patient deaths connected to him, the scale of what had been hidden behind the front door of an ordinary GP practice began to emerge. Harold Shipman's trial began at Preston Crown Court on the 5th of October 1999, by which point the case had already horrified the public. He was charged with the murders of 15 women and with forging the will of Kathleen Grundy, the former mayoress whose death had finally triggered the investigation that brought him down. The prosecution's case did not try to prove every suspicious death connected to Shipman. Instead, it focused on a selected group of victims whose cases showed a pattern: sudden death, Shipman's presence, questionable medical records, and in Grundy's case, a crude attempt to profit from the crime. A central part of the prosecution's argument was that Shipman had used his position as a trusted GP to administer lethal doses of diamorphine to patients who were not terminally ill, then falsified records to make their deaths appear natural. In the Grundy case, the evidence was especially damaging. Her body had been exhumed, diamorphine was found, and investigators discovered that Shipman had altered her medical notes after her death to suggest she had been dependent on the drug. The alleged will, leaving her estate to him, looked less like a masterpiece of criminal cunning and more like the sort of thing a man writes when he has been getting away with too much for too long. The defence denied that Shipman was a murderer, but the jury was presented with a pattern that became harder and harder to dismiss as coincidence. On the 31st of January 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, Shipman was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that he should never be released. The conviction was staggering enough on its own, but it also raised a much larger fear that these 15 murders were not the full story. That was why the trial shook British medicine so deeply. This was not a hospital orderly, a stranger, or a passing opportunist. This was a family doctor, a man trusted in homes, surgeries and sick rooms, using the authority of medicine as cover for murder. Once the verdict was delivered, the question was no longer whether Harold Shipman had killed. It was how many times he had done it, and how a system built around trust had failed to stop him. Harold Shipman's conviction did not end the story. In many ways, it opened the most disturbing chapter of all, because once he had been found guilty of murdering 15 patients, the obvious question was whether those were the only victims. The answer, after a lengthy public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith, was deeply alarming. The inquiry concluded that Shipman had killed at least 215 patients over a period of 24 years, and indicated that the real total was likely to be around 250. That finding transformed the case from a terrible local crime into one of the worst-known examples of serial murder by a medical professional anywhere in the world. The legacy of the case was not only about numbers, it was about trust, and how easily trust could be weaponized when systems were too fragmented, too deferential, or too slow to challenge a doctor's authority. The inquiry found serious weaknesses in death certification, cremation procedures, the monitoring of controlled drugs, and the handling of complaints or concerns about doctors. In plain terms, Shipman was able to exploit gaps between professional respect, routine paperwork, and institutional hesitation. He did not merely commit murders, he exposed how badly the system could fail when the wrong person wore the right professional mask. Those failures led to calls for major reforms. Government responses to the inquiry accepted the need for stronger safeguards, including tighter scrutiny of death certification, improved oversight of controlled drugs, and better systems for identifying dangerous patterns in medical practice. Later reform work repeatedly cited the Shipman case as a key reason for introducing greater independent scrutiny, including the use of medical examiners in the death certification process. In other words, Shipman's crimes changed not only how Britain remembered one doctor, but how Britain thought about patient safety itself. Harold Shipman took his own life by hanging in Wakefield Prison on the 13th of January 2004. There is something especially grim about the end of the Shipman story. He had spent years presenting himself as a reassuring figure in ordinary homes and surgeries, while carrying out murder behind the cover of care. His name now stands for the most extreme betrayal a doctor can commit. Trust matters, but trust without scrutiny is an unlocked door, and history has already shown what can walk through it. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Murder, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmurder.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/murdercoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.